This is my diesel truck that I put semi-stacks on, and you guys might be wondering how I did this with zero experience. I have no clue, but let's dive into it. It all started with this very bad idea. Essentially, I saw somebody driving near my house with some stacks on their Ram 3500, and I was like, you know what? I really like that idea. Let's replicate it. So I started doing my research, and I found this kit that was supposedly universal. Pretty sure it was like $500. It wasn't too bad, but it did require that you assemble the entire thing and that you basically manipulate your pre-existing 3-inch exhaust back, or I meant to say 4-inch. Now, I already had an axle dump on the car that ran right up to the top of the bed, so I was like, you know what? If we do some modification here, this is not going to be too bad. We're going to need to do some cutting, but it's not going to be that difficult. And realistically, the first thing that I was concerning myself with was actually measuring out how long the white pipe is with the pipes and making sure that everything was equidistant, right? We didn't want one pipe sticking out too far and being off center from the other one. So the exhaust tips needed to be the same distance from each other, and that's why I measured out the bed, picked up the middle point, and then saw where the drive shaft was relative to the middle point to see where I could drill my hole with a hole saw. I'm just removing the muffler and then we'll do some more measurements. Everybody loves exhaust hangers, right? It's not just me. Really hoping this muffler wants to cooperate. There you go. Since we took this guy off, what does that mean? Straight pipes. Oh my God, oops, did not mean to do that. Now before I just send it and have no clue where I'm going, I do want to put a pilot hole in and check underneath. Now at this point I was telling myself, that looks great, that's good placement, but then I really realized that that is way too close to the diesel tank. If we run any sort of piping next to it, we're going to melt right through the diesel tank. So that wasn't going to work, but that's all in hindsight, right? And then my drill wasn't producing enough torque to actually work with the 5-inch hole saw, so I had to go pick up another one and make a parts supply run. Now in hindsight, I don't even know why I ever tried to connect the Y pipe to the rest of the exhaust underneath and from the turbo back this way. Well, actually I do know why. It's because semi-trucks use flex pipe vertically, and I thought I could also do this. So I started cutting up my axle dump, taking some of the bends, and trying to weld it together. And I figured out that this wasn't a good idea and was not as stable as I thought it was going to be. So this was my prototype 1 that I wasted a lot of time welding and basically fabricating together. I even tried to get a reducer and also an adapter. Yeah, it just wasn't good or working, and I wasted money on flex pipe, but thankfully I was able to return the stuff I didn't use because it was just one big mess. At a certain point, I went and bought an even bigger hole saw, and I found out very quickly that you can't use a hole saw unless there's something in the center of it. So I tried to mix up the both of them, put a piece of wood under it. That just didn't work. So the reason why I was trying to drill a bigger hole in the bed was to accommodate the bigger flex pipe, but I didn't need to do all that. I would figure this out very soon. Regardless though, I still needed a way for the Y pipe to stand up in the bed. Now you guys might wonder, why not just lay it down like a lot of people do? Well, I actually use my truck for towing, and I happen to have bed liner. When those pipes get very hot, when those EGTs spike from towing, it might melt out the bed liner, so I was like, let's make some brackets to slightly suspend the Y pipe and reduce the contact it makes with the bed liner. That was my thought process, so I started to cut out 2 inches of mild steel, and we were going to weld this to the Y pipe so that I had a connection and a sort of stand. I should really start my own business, Below Average Welds LLC, but I mean, you can't knock it. It turned out pretty good. I mean, decent. It held up with no problems. And this is exactly where I had my eureka moment. I was like, you know what, let's use the flex pipe underneath and horizontally instead of using it vertically. Wow, should have thought of that from the beginning, right? But anyways, that ended up working, and I'll show you guys the setup. we went 90 degrees down from the bed on the wide pipe to the flex pipe, back to the regular exhaust that I already had, and then I decided it was time to check for exhaust leaks. I mean, that's really simple. Start up the car with just the Y pipe in there and see if anything leaks out from underneath the bed where the flex pipe is, because I don't really trust flex pipe that much. We know that the Y pipe with the 90 degree to the flex pipe is sitting perfectly, exactly where I have it with the tabs, because it clears the drive shaft and it also mates up with my pre-existing exhaust that comes from the turbo perfectly. So now we need to make holes so we can use the tabs that I made of stainless in order to bolt it to the bed. Now, stainless steel is not easy to drill into, and I did not realize this, but if there's one thing I learned, you need to use a lot of lubrication and go very slowly with the bits. So you keep spraying lubrication so that the bits don't start to burn and smoke, and you'll finally get through it. Lots of downward pressure too. I was putting my whole body weight on the tabs, so at least we know my welds are good, or that they'll hold. Let's not say good. Next step, I prioritize getting all the bolts through the actual mounts that I made to make sure that I don't try and mock up everything else and then have it be torqued differently when the bolts go in. So if you don't put the bolts in before you mock it up and see where the pipes are going to be and cut them, it can change whenever you put the bolts in because it'll pull it, and it's kind of obvious. So that was like a wise step that I took, and then I started taking more measurements, cutting up the pipe, smoothing it out, and seeing if I could actually get it to fit in the Y pipe, because for a good portion it wasn't fitting into the Y pipe. And then I decided, you know what, we need to even cut this down more to make the tip sit a little bit lower in comparison to the top of the cab. Unfortunately for me, I'm somewhat of a perfectionist, and I sat there and I was like, you know what, we can shorten this just the slightest bit more and it'll look a lot better. Obviously the cutting is kind of a pain. It's hard to get through stainless steel anything. The hotter it gets, actually the harder the metal it is, so that's what makes it so difficult. And then I actually ended up measuring the other 90-degree elbow that goes to the other side, and it didn't clear the bed. It was also hitting it, so I was like, we need to shorten this too. So it was time to bring out the ankle grinder once again. And once I finally got the other 90-degree elbow to actually fit, well, it was time to do cutting of that again, because I shortened up the other one significantly so that the tip would sit lower. So of course we're gonna have to do the same to that. So measure twice, cut twice. I'm pretty sure that's not the actual saying, but that's what I had to do. Now let's not be redundant, but I think that's a good length now. We measured, cut, and then placed the tip back on, and I realized we need to put some exhaust clamps on this setup just to get a general idea and to do some test trials. I wanted to make sure that my welds would actually hold up. What a concept. So I just put the clamps on temporarily. Let me remind you all, that is not the finished product. Let's see how it sounds.
Ready?
Yeah. It's not hitting, right?
Huh?
It didn't hit. I didn't hear it make any clanking noises.
No.
I think we might be good.
I think so.
Somehow we got it out of the garage. I don't even know how that was possible. We were off by about half an inch.
Is it clear? Let's see.
The only thing that really could solidify my fabrication was taking this thing on a road trip, so I decided it was time to do so.
Close.
Now trust me, when I say this, I'm fully aware. A lot of people will question, is this even okay to use in the rain? Well, I tested it out. I mean, I let it sit outside all day while it rained one day, right before my little trip, and it was completely fine. I actually did not see any sort of water being burned off in the exhaust, so those turnouts really prevent any sort of water getting in there. Not an issue. With these stacks, and there's only one issue. Had no problem with the bed liner melting or anything like that. I mean, the pipes don't even really get hot. You can just see that there's a slight exhaust leak. You can see some of the diesel soot on the clamps. That means I'm probably gonna have to weld this whole thing together. How are you enjoying this cold, huh?
I don't like it.
Cue the copious amounts of surface rust on the mild steel mounts, and the fact that I pretty much stripped away all of its protective qualities when I did the welding. So I think we're gonna have to go ahead and paint this. On top of that, those exhaust clamps are just not holding. You can see the tip is shaking freely. Yeah, unfortunately, welding is the answer. But hey, at the end of the day, it still held up whenever I swung it in the snow. Yes, it snowed in Florida. If you all want to check out that video, I will link it in the right corner of the screen. Pretty crazy stuff. It's officially time to get back to work. I know I have several exhaust leaks where the clamps are. It's time to get rid of them and start laying some tack welds. I also prepped up the piping because you always want to do that. So grinding it down is a good solution to make sure that you're not having any sort of contamination. You want these welds to actually last. Now here's the caveat. When I was laying the tack welds, I realized that this sort of filler material that I was using for mild steel wasn't working too well on the stainless steel along with the gas. So I was using a mix of argon and CO2, 75-25. Apparently that's not a good mixture. You need to pick up a special wire as well for stainless steel. It's called ER308L, so I picked up that, and then I needed a new type of gas called Stargon, or the Trimix. So basically this is a mix of helium, argon, and CO2, but the CO2 is a very limited amount, only at 2.5%. So I had to go through this learning process to figure out exactly what kind of wire and what type of welding gas I needed to produce a decent weld on the stainless steel. Without it, the welds looked whack and they were not fusing. Now I had to do this on repeat. I don't have any sort of stand, so I was just using jack stands, and it got quite difficult at certain points, you know, to actually follow the same line without blowing through the material, because for whatever reason, I had my settings set pretty decently, probably not perfect, but I followed the chart and it would blow through every now and then. So it would get too hot, go right through the metal, and then I'd be like, crap, I need to fill this in. And that really caused a big holdup, especially on the tips. I mean, the tips were a nightmare when I tried to weld them with the MIG gun. I probably should have called my buddy to do TIG welding before I decided to do that with the MIG, but it is what it is. I learned my lesson, right? Now, I'd like to reiterate this. I am not a welder by any means, but check out some of these welds I laid on practice bits. Yeah, it's a lot easier when it's flatter, and that's where the seat time, or I guess welding time, comes into play, where you get a lot better to do it on actual exhaust piping and go around with the MIG. Now, I mean, you can definitely see the difference. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Now, you guys remember how scratched up and how hideous those holes looked after I drilled into the bed in order to make my mounts. So we needed to re-bed liner this, so I went ahead and did so. This is going to provide some extra rust protection, and honestly took about 5 minutes. I'm not worried that this little patch is a different color than the rest of the bed liner, because over time it'll fade out, and none of my bed liner is actually the same tone. You can see it. Now here's where my perfectionism really didn't help my case. I figured I would grind down all of my MIG welds to have my buddy come and TIG weld and make some pretty passes. It doesn't really make much sense since I already laid down some solid welds, and this would result in a lot of wasted time. There was no real reason to actually do this beside aesthetic purpose. So I grinded down all my welds, and we had to go get a new gas because the gas we had was not suitable for TIG welding. That Trimix is only good for MIG welding with stainless. Now we're TIG welding with stainless filler rod, so we need 100% argon or it oxidizes really weird. So we had to go pick up the gas, waste even more time, pay even more money to rent out different types of gas, and then we finally started to lay down some TIG welds. Shout out to my buddy Brock who came over to do this. He's an apprentice at a fabrication shop that does all sorts of cool things for cars. Anyways, he's like, I'm gonna help you out. Let's go ahead and do this. Let's get some pretty passes. And this is what we ended up coming up with. Or I may more appropriately say what Brock came up with. While we were at it, I asked Brock, can you teach me how to TIG weld? Because I've never done it before. So this was my first attempt. We didn't really set the settings for this piece because we still had more to do, or Brock still had more to do. So it was too hot, but you guys get the general idea. I learned how to TIG weld. Anyways, I needed to go ahead and step up the sanding for all the pipe because now it's time to paint all of the Y pipe and the measurement tubing. That's all 90-degree stuff. So since I did grind it down with like a 60 grit to get it ready for welding, I needed to make sure that I worked up a couple of grits. So I think I started with like a 200 mop disc, then I went to a 320, and now it's ready for paint. If I'm being honest here, I didn't spend that much time on masking. It wasn't that important. I mean, you're not really going to overspray all the way up there. And for paint, I went with like a VHT header paint that's proofed up to like 2000 degrees, so you don't have to worry about the exhaust getting hot. I definitely don't recommend just getting a regular spray paint because it will melt off, or if it doesn't melt off, it'll flake off. So get yourself some header paint if you want to replicate this. I don't know if you want to, just throwing it out there. And the masking wasn't too bad. I did take a razor to like actually get the bottom of the tip or the bottom of the stack kind of clean. But yeah, I did the best I could. One last step here before we put it back on L truck, we need to make sure that we bring the paint to a semi-cure. So usually what you would do is put this in an oven, but since I have an exhaust and it heats it up to like 450 degrees anyways, I can just run the exhaust and heat cycle it a few times. That's literally the directions. You can heat cycle it on the car, but since we are handling it to get it back on the truck, and it is quite heavy, it's definitely going to bump on stuff. We're going to get fingerprints. I wanted to bring it to a semi-cure, so I used a heat gun and brought up the heat to maximum to hopefully get it to cure a little bit, and then I threw it back on the truck. Can't forget the fact that I went ahead and touched all of the chrome tips, and if you leave that on while you heat cycle it to, burn in that exhaust or cure the paint, it will literally permanently stay there. So I just wiped it all down with some isopropyl to make sure that my fingerprints weren't on the chrome.
So sick.
It kind of is truly cool to see what you're capable of doing, even if you have no clue what the heck you're doing. You just have to put your mind to it. Obviously, a lot of work went into fabricating these bed stacks. If you guys enjoyed this video, please remember to comment, like, and subscribe. I appreciate all the support, and if you want to see more projects like this, you need to hit that subscribe button. So I'll see you all. What's up, guys? This is Zesty Wash, and I'm going to show you what it does today.